Good morning. All right, welcome to our beautiful campus. Welcome to the Robbins School. We provide an exceptional business education that prepares and inspires our students to make a positive impact in their organizations, community, and society, and we're very proud of that. I'm Mickey Quinones, Dean of the Robbins School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's C-Suite conversation with Tom Gayner, co-CEO of Markel Corporation. Markel Corporation has been called a baby Berkshire Hathaway. So I guess that would make Tom the Oracle of Richmond.
We'll see.
As co-CEO, Tom oversees the investment operations of Markel through the Markel Ventures, while Richard Witt is responsible for the insurance side. I guess this arrangement brings new meaning to the term shared leadership, which is another term that we talk about a lot. Business publications often refer to Tom as one of the smartest people on Wall Street and the most quotable investor. And I suspect that's why a lot of you are here, to get some market advice. Founded in 1930, Markel employs over 17,000 people. I'm sure the best of those are spiders, and has nearly $7 billion in annual revenues and over $33 billion in assets. As one of our city's Fortune 500 companies, Markel is woven into the fabric of our community, and I would argue is one of our crown jewels. So thank you for being here very much. Leading our conversation this morning is Dr. Richard Coughlan from our management department. Dr. Coughlan began the C-Suite Conversation series in 2011 to highlight the challenges, opportunities, and decision-making processes of top leaders. Since then, the series has become one of the premier forums in our city for exploring contemporary business issues. And I know many of you come repeatedly to hear these great conversations, so thank you, Richard. I'd like to thank our sponsors for the C-Suite Conversations, PNC Bank, it's represented by Mike Matson, Head of Commercial Lending from Virginia. We also have Richard Bynum, Jeff Clemens, Brian Combs, James Garcia, Sonia McCormick, and Steve Plotzman from PNC. And the Chamber RBA is our other sponsor. It's represented by Brian Anderson, CEO of Chamber RBA, Kelly McCall, VP of Leadership, Community, and Resource Management, and I saw Mark Horrigan is here, who's the chair of the board of the Chamber. So thank you all very much for your support, and on to the conversation.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mickey. Welcome to all of you. It's great to see a couple of former C-Suite guests here. Mark Horrigan's here, Ryan Carey's here, and if I've missed one or two others, I think I also saw two future guests. So just to set up what else will happen the rest of this year. Brian Hortel from Timmons Group, I know is in the room. Jyot Singh, I think, he's going to be my guest in March, and I know he was on the list and hope he made it here this morning. But for the morning, our guest is Tom Gayner. Thank you very much for coming over.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you back on campus. I wanted to pick up on something that Mickey said about being co-CEO. Why didn't you and Richie just have a game of rock, paper, scissors to figure that out?
I was worried he'd win.
Yeah. In all seriousness.
He usually does.
It probably depends on what the game is. Very few Fortune 500 companies have tried this, only a couple dozen in the last 30 years. Why does it work at Markel?
Well, it's a great question and an accurate question. And I would tell people from an investment point of view, when I'm looking at companies, if I saw a company that had a co-CEO structure, I would normally say, sell that stock. It's not going to work. Now here's what's different about Markel. First off, we had it role modeled for us for 40 years. So between Alan Kirshner, Steve Markel, and Tony Markel, despite the fact that they had different titles along the way at different points, and Alan was consistently chairman, effectively they functioned as a Roman triumvirate, and they were three co-CEOs. Richie and I both have been at Markel for 30 years now, so we were in the room as understudies of Alan and Tony and Steve for 30 years, so we saw how it could work. So we've been trained and apprenticed in a way that's quite unusual. And what I would say, here's one thing that really matters, is that amongst the three of them, you could think everything that was in the income statement reported up to Tony Markel. So the insurance underwriters, the branches, the sales, the expenses, administration and running the business. At the end of the day, Tony was ultimately responsible for anything in that stream. Things on the balance sheet, the loss reserves, the investments, the strategic decisions about acquisitions, things of that nature, that ultimately reported up to Steve. And Alan was the tiebreaker and the peacemaker between the two of them. So I had been in those rooms many times, Richie and I both, where there would be extreme disagreement. and vigorous discussion, as only family members can have sometimes. Richie and I actually, we have conversations, we have differences of opinions, but we let each other finish our sentences. So I'd been in situations where that was not the case, but what happened in that room was that at the end of the day, one would say to the other, I think that's a crazy idea. I think you're wrong. But that's your area, and that's your responsibility. So if that's the call, that's the call. And they would walk out of that room. And I was fortunate enough to be inside the room. And outside the room, it's mom and dad unified, that there was a unified message to the team. Yep. So Richie and I were very fortunate we get to apprentice under that system. Now the way Richie and I split it is that on the insurance operations, it's Richie's call. He is the final word on that. And we're going to be in a room, and sometimes we'll disagree and we'll have a conversation. But if he makes that call on insurance, it's his. On investments and on our non-insurance operations ventures, I'm the one who's ultimately responsible for that. Mm-hmm. So the way things work, if an insurance issue comes up, a deal, something that would touch both sides, as a matter of courtesy, we will each talk to one another first. But then the decision is made and it's transmitted through the organization with unity. So that's the mechanical way it works. The second thing is, and I encourage you to ask your other C-suite folks that you have out here, being the CEO of a company means you're in a position of ultimate responsibility. So I think our employee count with the latest deal is up to 19,000. Mm-hmm. So what both motivates me and keeps me awake, keeps me on the edge of my seat, is I feel responsible for 19,000 people. That's a heavy responsibility. Mm-hmm. And it really is kind of nice to have someone else as your partner, side by side, who can viscerally understand the responsibility that you have. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah.
30 years in investments is magical. You mind telling the story about the conversation you had with Ned Reynolds?
Oh,
this is
God,
during
yes.
the years that Tom was at Davenport and Company. You were a research analyst after a short time at PwC. But Ned Reynolds,
right.
who some in the room might know from his time here in Richmond, gave you some advice about how to survive in investments. What did he say?
Well, he did indeed. And Ned Reynolds was one of those people that I think about, and I didn't seek out Ned Reynolds. I didn't know how brilliant he was, all that kind of stuff. It was just sort of fortuitous finding and bumping into somebody. And I don't know if any of you have memories of Ned Reynolds or know anything about him. Brilliant man, Harvard guy, so I know it's no UR, but he did manage to go to Harvard. And if you looked at Ned, I think by the time he was in his 70s, he still hadn't bought any new clothes from when he was an undergraduate. So you'd sort of wonder if this guy was doing okay, but trust me, he was. And he had a very unusual manner. And one day, so I was a brand new broker at Davenport here in town. And it was in the old days when the ticker tape actually was a physical thing, and it would go by. And it was a hot August afternoon. And the ticker tape going by was this electromechanical thing, and it would create this kind of hum and whir in an office. And you could just imagine Richmond, Virginia office, August, the hum and whir. And I didn't have any clients, didn't have anybody to talk to, and I was just standing next to Mr. Reynolds as the ticker was going by. And Ned had this way, he would hold his arms like this, and he wouldn't make eye contact with you, and he would sort of rock like this. And so out of the blue, we were not engaged in conversation other than standing side by side. He said, "Tom, the secret," and this was the pacing of his words, "the secret to success in the investment business is lasting the first 30 years. So I turned to him and sort of, "Well, what do you mean there, Mr. Reynolds?" He said, "Well, every generation goes through everything, and you'll be better at it when you see it the second time around."
So you're celebrating 30 years at Markel?
I am indeed, and a little more than 30 years in the investment business. And it's funny, so there was a great friend of mine who I told this story to, who's roughly the same age as I am. And I told him this story, 20 years ago or something like that. So we get to the 08-09 financial crisis, where my friend and I both had about 25 years in on the investment business. And my friend says, "Man, I was hoping we could round up to 30, but apparently we're going to..." apparently we're going to have to live the whole thing. So the financial crisis of 08-09 hit me. You're sort of 25 and 26 in that 30-year generational curve, but yeah, had to live the whole 30.
If you don't mind, I'd like to rewind just a bit into your youth. The 100-acre farm in southern New Jersey is where you grew up. Strikes me, siblings considerably older than you, 14 and 18 years older than
Right.
you. So in some ways you had the farm a bit to yourself, Tom, and it strikes me that one of the habits you might have developed during that time is one of reflection.
Mhm.
And I know you've said that it is important to read the income statements and the balance sheets for what they tell you, but it's also really important to step back and to almost think about it as a poem and what's the story that's being told there. You honed that habit of reflection on the farm, I suspect.
Well, as long as I didn't have to do any farm work. Yeah, I'd rather read a book.
And we'll talk a little bit about your reading tastes. Where I wanted to go, though, was to Friday nights when you're 10, 11, or 12 years old. Your viewing habits were what?
Oh, I was the ultimate nerd. And fortunately, I did find a girl who liked me back. So I have been, and she was the first one. So I asked her to marry me. And we're still married 38 years later. But this is how high a threshold this might have been for nerddom. So my grandmother and I would watch Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser.
Yeah.
And that was our regular Friday night sort of deal.
And
yes.
your grandmother wasn't necessarily an active investor, but she did have stocks that your grandfather had given her.
She did indeed, and in fact, I would say my grandmother probably would have been in the 90th percentile in terms of investment performance. And here's the true story of what happened. So in the little small town of the area outside the farm, business people in those days in the 1950s and 60s that would be a small town banker or drugstore guy or car dealer or whatnot. Everybody had a portfolio of stocks, and it was kind of something that you did. You owned individual stocks, and you talked about them in conversation. So my grandfather would have been one of those people in a small town. Not a big portfolio, but just what small town business people did. So when he died, my grandmother was the kind of widow that never made another decision. So she lived in the same house for the rest of her life. His suits hung in the closet for the rest of her life. His shoes were on the floor of the closet. The 12, 15 stocks that she owned, that she inherited from him, there was never another thing that was done to that portfolio. No buys, no sales, no nothing. But among those 12 or 15 stocks were Lockheed Martin, PepsiCo, and General Public Utilities, which was the owner of 3 Mile Island, if you remember that story, and a couple other things. So 9 or 12 other things. Well, the other 9 or 12, it didn't matter. They could have all gone to zero. But those 3 stocks in and of themselves did so well and compounded for so long that she was basically able to live a reasonable existence for the rest of her life because she did not interrupt the flow of compounding that took place by finding something that was really good and being able to hold on to it. So it was funny. She was an avid student of the market. She gave me some very formative books about Louis Rukeyser's books. And when I graduated from 8th grade, in those days, oftentimes small towns had local banks. And my uncle was the president of the little local bank. And she gave me 5 shares of this local bank as my 8th grade graduation present, which maybe was $100 or something like that. And she said, Tommy, would you rather be a depositor in the bank or an owner of the bank? So she was incredibly aware of things, and she chose to not act, but by not acting, had this great compounding. And I must say, it really irritated my Uncle Dick that I would walk in that bank. I own this joint here. It's kind of a long lunch you took there. But it was really helpful, really helpful.
Your father also shaped you. I know he was an accountant, also a businessman, and involved in some real estate dealings. But you pursued accounting really because your dad did. He had his office in your home, and you would frequently come home from school and just sit in the office and listen to him in conversation.
Yes, indeed. So, and there's a variety of streams that go into that. So, for any of you old enough to remember the TV show Green Acres, I would say my father was halfway between Mr. Douglas and Mr. Haney. And so he had worked for a predecessor firm of Deloitte in Philadelphia and the big city stuff and whatnot. And he'd had a belly full of that. So he left public accounting, as so many of us refugees do. I think Jim Carlton here in the audience somewhere along the line from our Coopers and Lybrand days, who was much more successful as an accountant than I was. But anyway, so my dad left, bought this farm in South Jersey, which was sort of where we grew up. And he started a tax practice and business services. He was the first CPA that county ever had. That's how rural it was. And because he was sort of like the only financial guy in the whole county for bankruptcy reorganizations, not that there were a lot of them, but the judge knew who he was, so he would often be appointed to be the guy to work out a bankruptcy and try to rehabilitate a business and whatnot. So he did that. He had his office in our house. And also, I grew up in an era where you didn't have central air conditioning. So there were 2 room air conditioners in our house, one of which was in my parents' bedroom, the other of which was in my dad's office. So I'm not that stupid. I would hang out in my dad's office because it was air conditioned and none of the other rooms were. So I would be in his office and I would just be doing my homework and hanging out. And I'd hear him talk on the phone to people. I'd hear people come in and out and hear him interact and see him in the flow of things. And like fathers and sons, we talked about baseball and we talked about football and normal stuff, but we also nerded out. And because he read the Wall Street Journal, I read the Wall Street Journal. And because he talked about business and just sort of infused, it's sort of like, at Syracuse these days, you got Coach Boeheim, you got Bobby Boeheim, his son, playing on the team. Yep. And that's a regular phenomenon, the coach's sons. Well, when you see a coach's son on a team, what are they good at? Free throw shooting and sort of some of the discipline stuff, because they just have grown up in a way that's just a thing, a unique way. So I was kind of a coach's son kind of kid, growing up around business and investing and those sorts of thoughts.
So why didn't you pursue accounting for longer than you did?
Well, long and short story there, and again, I don't want to tease Jim Carlton here too much because he was my boss at Coopers and Lybrand in the early days. So having this practice, and my father never kept a timesheet, and the way he would work would be that he was on annual retainer for somebody. So if he was your guy and he did your taxes and was the person you would talk to, he had sort of an annual retainer fee. And if that fee was not appropriate somewhere along, it got adjusted. But he had year after year after year relationships with people, so you could sort of get it directionally right. So he didn't keep a timesheet. And he also was very entrepreneurial, so sometimes he'd help people put a deal together, and for doing that, I'll take 3% of the economics, or 5%, or buy shares, so, would invest and contribute his services in exchange for a piece of the equity kind of stuff.
Yep.
I thought that's what accountants did. Big 8 accounting as it was at the time, now Final 4 accounting, not so much. So you have to keep timesheets, and I'm not disciplined enough to keep a timesheet. So it was not what my father did. And I joke, I was an accountant who was more interested in dollars than numbers. There's a profound difference between the two. So there was a guy named Mike Beal, who had been an accountant at Coopers as well, who had the same path that I did in terms of, get the mood like. I think somebody's probably leaning against the light switch.
Back in the corner there.
Would be my guess.
We'll make sure.
There we go, yeah. It's like that story about the preacher who was a bit deaf and he conducted a 3-hour prayer meeting kneeling on the cat. So, yeah, you don't know what you're leaning up against. But, so I met Mike, was introduced as a referral, and Mike had an interesting job at Edinburgh, which, by the way, he still does. And Julian Avery introduced himself earlier in the room, working for Mike, and it's a great privilege to work for Mike, because he was both a broker with clients, but he also did research for the firm and wrote reports that the firm would use and be involved in the discretionary asset management world. So Mike and I kind of hit it off, and after a while he said, hey, people around here have been impressed with how you're doing. You want to come here and do what I did? And I said, do what I do? And I said, well, that sounds like fun, but it's 18 months here and I need 6 more months to get my CPA stamp. So can I wait 6 months? And Mike said, well, we were kind of thinking now. And I said, well, now is good. So I left and went over to Davenport. I was there from 84 through 90, thought I'd be there forever. Loved it, still do. But in 86, Markel went public.
At $8.33.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And luck of the draw, I was the analyst who was assigned to cover that. And so you might want to ask a different question or get a different stream. But so I got to cover Markel, got to know Steve Markel. He became a client and a friend. I was familiar with the Berkshire model. And so from 86 through 90, Steve and I worked as client and friend. And by 90, Markel did one of their double the size of the company deals. And Steve had been handling the investments by himself and thought he might like it to have a wingman.
What was the first stock that you bought on behalf of Markel?
Berkshire Hathaway. Yeah.
You had looked at it earlier in your career, had you not, when it was 380 or?
Indeed, I did. Yes, this is how stupid you are when you're young. There's so many things. I mean, the old joke is good judgment comes from experience, which comes from bad judgment, and this would be one of those examples. So in '84 is when I first read an article in Fortune magazine about Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett, and literally, I mean, the scales fell from my eyes. It was like Saul turning into Paul on the road to Damascus kind of experience. So I'm just reading this and just word after word, just precision and common sense and beauty there. And so I went into, so the head of the department that Mike and I worked in was a guy named Joe Antrim, who many of you might know. And Joe was also a great mentor and teacher, but Joe was rough. And he did not brook any kind of bullshy or sloppiness. He's a pretty tough guy. And I went to Joe's office and I had this article in my hand and it said, "Hey Joe, have you ever heard of this guy named Warren Buffett?" And he says, "It's Buffett, you idiot," and threw me out of his office. And I looked it up, and at the cutting edge technology of the time, which was the S&P tear sheets. And I'm an accountant. I mean, I'm a failed accountant, but I'm not that bad an accountant. I could see the numbers, and I knew they were good. But the stock was 380 some bucks, and like a 23-year-old idiot that I was at the time, I said, no stock could possibly be worth $384. So I did not buy any. And I kept watching it and kept seeing it go up, which in and of itself was a learning experience about something. And by the time Steve and I connected and we were doing the deal in 1990, Steve said, "Do it, man." So the very first stock that we bought for Markel was Berkshire Hathaway. It was $5,750 at the time. It's now 330 some or something, so it's worked out all right.
I guess it has.
And we've learned so much along the way as well, but that was the connective tissue.
I'd like to talk about four of the largest holdings that you now have, if we could go through individual equities. So the first is a local firm called CarMax, and Bill Nash sat in that seat not so long ago, their CEO.
Right.
What did you like about CarMax, and why have you held it and added to it for as long as you have?
Sure, and it's funny, that tends to be the stock that people ask me the most about, because there's ambiguity about it from time to time, there's financing, there's volatility of car sales, and there's always something to be worried about in terms of CarMax. But let me tell you the story, and there's a couple different streams. And this, perhaps it illustrates the point of both the quantitative work you should do and the discipline, and also the qualitative way you should think about things, and they're both incredibly important. So, start with the qualitative stuff. Growing up on the 100-acre farm outside of Philadelphia, I was raised as a Quaker, and Philadelphia is kind of the Jerusalem of Quakerdom. Mm-hmm. And the old joke about the Quakers is, they came to America to do good, and they did well. And one of the components of the reason Quakers did well, they typically were merchants. So, as a matter of faith, as a Quaker merchant, what you believe as a Quaker is that everybody's equal before God. So, in years, for thousands of years, merchants would usually haggle for goods. So I got this. Well, how much is it? Well, what do you want to pay for it? And haggling was a process. As a component of faith, Quakers don't do that. So you sell for a fixed price as a merchant. So that was just the way I grew up and had that ethos about me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if people know the story of R.H. Macy's department store, which is a tough business these days, but let's say they've had a pretty good 150-year run. Well, R.H. Macy himself was a Quaker, and he was born in Nantucket, and there was a Quaker community there that were merchants that outfitted the whaling ships. Mm-hmm. I promise you, this is ultimately going to be about CarMax.
I'm with you.
So R.H. Macy was a very ambitious guy, and Nantucket was too small for his ambitions. So there was this place called New York City that was growing at the time, which it still is, by the way. So he goes to New York City in these 1860s or thereabouts, And he sets up this dry goods store, which is called department store these days. And the goods, the dishes and the towels and the sheets and whatnot, because he was willing to sell for a fixed price, he was able to put an advertisement in the paper that said, set of dishes, $2. Set of sheets, $1. That was radical at the time. Merchants did not do that because, to do that and fix your price would give up the opportunity to get a really fat deal sometimes.
Sure.
And the rest is history. R.H. Macy took off because he was the first one to do that. So when CarMax came around, immediately the idea of selling things at a fixed price in a haggle market, that resonated with me. I'd seen that movie before. So, number one. Now, here's where the quantitative stuff starts to enter into the picture. They had the idea. The concept made sense to me. I knew some of the people just from friendships that were working over there, and they were good people. So it was a hot concept at the time. And Circuit City, which was still among us at the time, was the sponsor and started it. And CarMax was technically a tracking stock. So it was not a technical common stock at the time. It was tracked. And it was pretty hot. So I did not buy any at the initial IPO of it. It was $20 a share, and this is pre a couple of splits. I don't know what that would equate to right now. But AutoNation also, at the same time, was experimenting with the concept, and the two of them were at war. And basically, they had this battle between the two of them that was almost a race to the bottom, and they each damaged one another. So that stock went from 20 down to, it might have bottomed out at less than $1. Now, by the time it got down to about 7 or 8, I started nibbling at it and started buying some because I thought it was a good value at that point. And here was the other thing, and this is accounting nerddom. Because of the tracking stock in the initial Circuit City guarantees, when CarMax would open a facility and do a sale leaseback, to be creditworthy, Circuit City guaranteed the lease. So those were multi-year deals, 10 and 20-year deals for the sale leaseback. And so this is 2 or 3 years into it. And the idea that CarMax would go bankrupt and then Circuit City would be responsible for the lease payments, it was in Circuit City's best interest not to let that happen. So it was my sensation, just reading the cues and understanding who was on the hook for what, enabled me to have some confidence that CarMax would be allowed to play out its hand and have a little time to see if the concept worked or not.
And it's now the largest holding.
Second largest. Berkshire's the largest.
Yeah, my fault.
But I mean, the stock's $90 right now, and we have stock that's less than $1. I mean, we've made hundreds of millions of dollars on it from that kind of insight. And I think the basic proposition still works. They've adapted and tried to figure out the new world and technology and new changes over time, which you need to do. And it's my judgment that they're still being successful, which is why we're sticking with it. But that's how that came about.
I've got 3 other equities I want to
Sure.
ask about, but before I do that, you have described a purchase of a small investment in a firm as a library card.
Right.
1 minute, what do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes people tease me about owning a lot of different stocks. And library card is one concept where, because you have that card, you can go into the library and you can see everything in the world. I mean, the library is an amazing resource. So by owning a little bit of something, it makes me think about something. The other analogy I use to describe it is think about, a Major League Baseball organization. And so there's the Major League team, but then there's the AAA team, the AA team, the Single A team. So there's 26, 27 players in the roster of the Major League team, but there might be 150 or so players on the organization. So by owning a little bit of a stock and having a lot of different stocks, which we do, I have a Single A team. I have a library card that it makes me think about it more robustly to own 100 shares of something than I do if I don't own any. It takes it from being a completely academic idea to I got a bet. Like if tomorrow Central Michigan was playing East Tennessee, which my son would say that's directional Michigan versus directional Tennessee.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know those schools. I don't have anybody that went there with no family ties to either one of those. So if we want to watch that game and we're going to sit here and drink a beer, you know what I want to do? I want to bet $10. I don't even care which side you want. It just will help me focus on the game.
Sure.
So I want a little skin in the game. I want a little money on it to make me think about things. And in so doing, that just creates this awareness web that from time to time I see somebody doing well or I gain more confidence in something and they get promoted. They go from the single A team to double A to triple to majors and vice versa of things that will go down or lose their role in the organization. But that's the thought process.
There's a proposal out there that baseball is going to shrink actually the minor leagues and consolidate, but you're going to keep the portfolio as wide as it is. I
Yeah,
think.
we'll be old school about that.
Gotcha. The other ones I wanted to ask about, in the summer of '86, my first real internship was at the Marriott headquarters outside of Washington, and you all have had Marriott in the portfolio for a very long time. It's also among the top 10 holdings. Story I tell in class fairly often is that I remember being an intern, first or second week in the internship, and we're down in the employee cafeteria, and I look over and I say to one of the other interns, that looks like Bill Marriott right there, and he's pushing his tray along the cafeteria line just as anybody else would, and I remember following him, my eyes following him, and he just went and sat at a table. There was no executive dining room, or if there was, he wasn't in it.
Right.
And it really struck me, the image of him going through that line, but also that when he sat down among 8 or 10 other employees, he did more listening than talking. It was very apparent to me that that's the kind of man, CEO that Bill Marriott was.
It still is.
Please say a word or two about Marriott and why you're so fond of the firm.
Sure. Well, for one, they helped me to not sleep in the rain probably about 100 nights a year.
Gotcha.
I could whip out my Marriott card, so I'm a brand loyal to it. And it's an interesting notion. It's not unlike the Berkshire story a little bit. So all the things you say, I agree, and it's a great firm that has a great ethos and service, and you think, gosh, there's so many stories. So Marriott owns the Ritz-Carlton. And I can remember the very first time I was lucky enough to go to a meeting at the Ritz-Carlton in Naples, Florida, and my wife was there with me. And sometimes you're walking around, I'd never been there before, this is really nice, and you'd bump into somebody on the staff, you say, how do I get to the Lafayette room or something, and they would give you the directions, and I would say thank you, and they would say, it's my great pleasure, Mr. Gayner. Wow, and this happened repeatedly. So I noticed, and frankly, it's a phrase my wife and I use to make sure we're being polite to one another. He says, it was my great pleasure, Mrs. Gayner. It was my great pleasure, Mr. Gayner. So ultimately, after this, I realized this was not an accident. How's this happening? So there was an assistant manager, and I made inquiry. And if you think about the demographics of the workforce of a Marriott hotel, those people did not go to the University of Richmond. I mean, they're coming from backgrounds not as affluent and as privileged as what those of us in this room are lucky to come from. So the guy told me, so at the Ritz-Carlton, says, if we hire somebody, the first thing we do is we treat them to a 5-star dining experience in the dining room. And then we work backwards from that meal to teach them what it took to put that meal on the table. That's the training program. Because in their mind, they could not conceptualize, they've never had a frame of reference what a meal at a fancy restaurant like that is. That's brilliant, as one aspect of why I like that company. And then to connect it to the Berkshire stuff about, when you got a good idea, let's really hit the bid and go with it. So, I mean, I knew enough about Marriott from being on the road, having a Marriott credit card, those kinds of stories to own some Marriott. So it was a stock we owned, from 1990, pretty close on, pretty early. But we only owned a little bit of it. And here's where the old accounting training and the quantitative stuff can get in the way of productive, thoughtful thinking about it. I never bought any more because I'd always say, oh, the PE is a little high, or I know it's trading at the high end, and it just didn't jump out at you as being, a real solid buy with a catalyst today. But it just kind of kept chugging along and doing the business. Well, then what happened is in September 11th and the terrorist attacks, hotel stocks fell off the roof because everybody's thinking, oh, nobody's going to travel. Well, I was at least smart enough not to panic about that and say, I know it might be a bad quarter or two, but the world's going to be okay. And so I think Marriott's going to be all right. And wow, it's a bargain now. So at that point, really backed up the truck and bought a bunch more. And so the throw weight we had behind the idea went up a lot. But then I said, that was really stupid. Personally, I'd owned it probably since 1984 in this tiny little bit. Now, it did well. Like my grandmother, I was not so stupid as to sell it, but I never put enough throw weight behind it. So I never sold it. But starting after 2001, there was that episode where we bought a bunch. But pretty much, I would almost guess that every quarter that has gone by since 2001, we've continued to add to our Marriott holdings. So on a dollar-weighted basis, we own a ton more of it than we would have. So our percentage returns on Marriott might be lower, but our actual dollar returns are higher because we've put throw weight behind it. It's like being at a poker table. So the other night, and my colleague Jeremy Noble was there with me that Friday night in a game that's been going on for over 30 years, episodically. And so that particular night, I did walk away with a little more money than I came in with, and for 4 or 5 hours of playing, I won 3 hands that night, just 3. And I think I might have played 5. But there were 3 hands in which the odds were in my favor that I bet into it. So there were a lot more hands that I lost or didn't play than I won, but I walked away with money because the weighted average of the bet were correct in putting money in the pot when you had the odds to do so.
Gotcha.
So the throw weight that you put behind a particular idea, and Marriott's it's one of the best examples ever of don't get caught up in the day-to-day stuff. If you really have profound conviction in the business itself, get on that train and look to just keep adding to it if you are right about your fundamental thesis. If you're not right or things change, and they do, and they change at an increasing rate, then be willing to get off that train and move on. But that's what I do all day, every day, is think about that. And there's a lot more thinking. The relationship of thinking to actions is a lot to a little. But there's a lot that goes into each of those little actions.
Jeremy Noble is the CFO of Markel. He's a graduate of this school, the University of Richmond, and I'm thrilled that he is here. How about a quick story on Home Depot?
Home Depot, yeah. That's an easy and a quick one. Sorry for the long answer. This is short one. So in the 08-09 financial crisis, when things were just awful, Home Depot got very, very, very cheap. And as a home owner, I can tell you, there's times when I've spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars just to make it look like it was before. I don't want to make light of this, but one time in the house we lived at, not this far from here, the siding, was some 1970s stuff, and it was not good. And I said, my house has cancer. and literally, that's almost what it was. We had to take epic amounts of siding off and put new siding up, and again, $20,000. And that was not a discretionary spend on my part. So. But Home Depot and Lowe's at that time, people thought housing in crisis and subprime mortgages and banks and who knows what and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of people with a lot of houses that whether they want to or not are going to spend money there.
These aren't very complicated businesses.
No, they're not.
None of the ones that we just talked about are that complicated.
I'm not that smart.
And you once said the things you really know about are things like sugar and dirt.
Right.
Those are the bases from which you really begin to look out into the business world.
Correct.
You gave a talk at Google, I think in 2015, and in the Q&A, there's somebody asks you to provide, an analysis of Google, and you said, "That's not my space. I'm not good at picking out the next hot thing and trying to figure out." So Silicon Valley to you is a bit of a foreign territory, one that you've chosen not to get too heavily involved in.
Ooh, well, that was something where I made a mistake, and I did not learn and be disciplined as I should have been about the way in which things were changing. So again, being a student and approaching things with an open mind, I kept studying and kept trying to learn. So I made that mistake early by not participating early, but as time went by, I did indeed start to. And I can remember something very, very stupid that I said at Google. And it haunts me how stupid I am from time to time, but I said, one of the things I don't get about sort of real technological whiz-bang stuff, and Google with the initial thing was, that's like catching lightning in a jar. Something spectacular happened. It's not sort of a compounding sort of return that you can schedule out and see compounding happen year after year. There was nothing, and then there was this immense thing. And catching and finding immense things. I don't know how to do that. Even the people who do it don't know how to do it. But they accomplish it from time to time.
Sure.
It's hard for that to be systemic. Well, Google caught lightning in a jar. They then turned into a systemic thing where they would, sort of in a biological amoeba-like fashion, keep moving to ancillary markets over and over again. And data, which has become the new oil, you could soundly make decisions and iterate and move and do the next thing and the next thing. It's way more profound and way more systemic than I thought it was. And fortunately, 5 or 8 years ago, I started recognizing my mistake and at least dollar cost averaging and beginning to buy Google and Apple and Facebook and some of those things, because you can really, as an accountant, look at the numbers and see what the cash flows are, and see that they're systemic. Now that being said, the chasm between the winner-take-all companies and the wannabe companies is as wide as it's ever been, and there's still this epic gulf. And there's all these companies that come up that get funded by today's capital markets that want to be the next Google or the next Apple or whatnot. Count me from Missouri on that one. I'm still relatively skeptical, more open-minded than I used to be, and learning. But jumping over that chasm to go from catching lightning in a jar once to a system is hard and an amazing accomplishment when you see it.
We're 40 minutes in, and I haven't asked you at all about Markel Ventures. So I'd like to spend a bit of time. Let's set this up for the audience. You do indeed invest in stocks, but you also occasionally now make huge investments in companies. And among those first were a local firm, AMF Bakery
Correct.
Systems was among the initial. So talk about this family of companies and how it's grown over the years and what it means to the larger Markel Corporation.
Right. Well, family is the great word to use because the Markel family legacy and family business and the long-term nature of a family, the idea of generationally making things better for the next generation. There's all kinds of streams that are there. Got Joanna Bergeron from CapTech here, and Andrew Crowley, I think I saw him earlier, who works with me on the Markel Ventures team, and he's critical because I get to operate up here and generalize a lot. Andrew helps check the details for me and is a spectacular partner in that sense. So Markel Ventures started out, the first deal we did was in 2005. Mm-hmm. The first time we talked about doing that was in 1990 when I joined Markel with Steve. And we were laying out the architecture of what we thought Markel would be, seeing the Berkshire model, going from investing in public equities and thinking about them as businesses as opposed to stocks, and thinking about what's a good business, what's a bad business, how you would value that, how you would think about it. Well, instead of buying 1% of Marriott, how about we buy 80% or 100% of a business where, again, we like the economics of it. So we had that thought in our mind from 1990. Markel was so tiny in 1990 that really wasn't an actionable idea. But things went well. The equity portfolio went well. We developed credibility with the regulators who regulate the insurance businesses, such that the degrees of freedom to do things increased, both quantitatively from the amount of money we had and the credibility we had with the regulators, people looking over us. So in 2005, it just so happened the stars lined up that AMF Bakery Equipment came for sale. I happened to know personally Ken Newsom, who was the CEO. We had never done a deal like this before because I knew Ken. And Ken allowed me to take a look at the business. And Ken is a very disciplined, buttoned-up, hardcore kind of guy. There was a 52-page PowerPoint deck that had been prepared for this sale, and he wanted to show that to me. And I said, I don't want to look at that. I'm an accountant. Give me the financial statements for the last couple of years. So he gives me the financial statements for the last couple of years, and I look at it and I say, oh, this is a good business with a bad balance sheet. I get that. I mean, the gross margins were fine. It was just over-levered. I said, well, I know how to fix that problem. You throw some money at it. Let's lower the water level down a little bit so that the business can persist. And now here's where it swings back to the qualitative stuff. So when it was over-levered or highly levered, when a bakery equipment machine broke, that was a really bad day for Ken. And it was a bad day because you had an interest bill to pay and you had an unhappy customer at the same time. That's an immense tension to live under. I said, Ken, I'm going to take care of the balance sheet for you. And here's what, I'm not rooting for machines to break, but I know they do in the real world.
Yeah.
And instead of that being a bad day, I now want that to be a good day. Because I want you to go to your customer, fix it, make it right, make your customer happy. And if you do that, over a period of years, what will happen is your customer will come to depend on you. You're the go-to guy. You make their business work. They'll pay you fairly for that. You don't need to gouge them. You just need to be paid fairly for that. And because we've lowered the water level,
Yep.
we can absorb the point-to-point volatility that will exist. Well, bakery is not a fast-growing business. It's GDP at best. And that was a $50 million business at the time. It's a $250 million business these days. Some of that has been through some bolt-on acquisitions, but more than half of that has been the organic growth of the business that's not organically growing. How do you do that? You treat the customers well, and you take care of them. Again, which echoes back to the CarMax story, echoes back to the Marriott way, echoes back to being a great, it's an ecosystem that all forms. And all the stuff you see in the paper today about ESG, that's not a new thing. That's something that a good business person has always thought of, how to run things in a sustainable way so that it keeps getting better over time, so that society is still glad you're there, so that somebody doesn't show up and point a finger at you for having done something wrong. Because whether there was a rule book for you or not, there's human being stuff that you should do and you should not do. So if there was no rule book anywhere, what would you do? Well, do that, and you'll be fine. And the new labels come up. But so the point is, AMF has done well. And by virtue of the fact that we did that deal, instead of this being theoretical and me talking about it, something had been done. And that in and of itself created this flow of other people saying, oh, I didn't know you could do that. And it has just flooded since then. For the last 4 or 5 years, given the financial markets and pricing, we've not really participated in any of the traditional auction processes of the private equity, but we've done 4 or 5 spectacular deals and spectacular businesses, and Joanna is part of one of them. The CapTech conversation with Sandy Williamson, that started 6 years before the deal was consummated. So we're going to do the right thing. We're going to have conversations. We'll build the relationship. And when the time is right, okay, then and it works for both sides, we'll put it together and make it happen. Sometimes that was a record until there was recently one, the VSC deal that we just did. That was 7 years between the first conversation and consummation. So CapTech got surpassed on that particular record. And by the way, I'd prefer them to take a little less time than that.
I bet.
Sometimes they happen quicker than that. But again, that's where the cumulative advantage of being steady and consistent has helped. And Markel Ventures writ large, from 2005 when it was a $50 million business with a $5 million run rate. Last year it rounds to $2 billion of top line revenue and $260 some million worth of EBITDA. So it's been a heck of a ride, and we're now up to I think about 19,000 people all together. And again, being responsible for that is on one hand a very heavy responsibility. But I look around and I see Joanne and I see Andrew and I see Jeremy, and I love being in the field with the people running these businesses, because they love their people, they love what they do, they're turning themselves inside out to take care of people. Again, in the unfortunate political environment in which we live, and people think about, there's just this demonization of business people. What a mistake. What a dreadful mistake. And if you're a business person, hold your head up high for what you do. Because what I observe from the 19,000 people that are part of our organization is there are 19,000 people turning themselves inside out to take care of somebody else. That's what a business does. And if you don't do that in business, if you are not solving somebody else's problem, you're going to go away. You're not going to last. You're not going to be S as in sustainable. It's just common sense. So to build this organization and be part of this organization where you're just committed to helping other people on a very human dimension, that resonates deeply with me. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning, and it's fun. And by the way, it's financially very successful. So that seems win-win.
Loyalty and reciprocity are two of the things that
Exactly.
really come up in that aspect of the conversation. A couple of comments on CapTech. So Kevin McQueen was a guest in this series as well. He and I grew up playing baseball against one another in Columbia, Maryland. So he and I have known each other for 40 years. Captech now has co-CEOs, doesn't it?
It does.
So Steve Holdyke is operating as a co-CEO as well, and Joanne is really running the company anyway. But in any case, the other couple things I wanted to talk about in the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to frame a question this way. Imagine that you and I were going for beers, and I gave you a choice about who we might invite.
Why do we have to imagine that?
Oh, it's a little early, Tom, but anyway, I should be done here about 5 o'clock today.
Okay.
Mark Cuban or Mark Twain, and then the other one I have for you is John D. Rockefeller or John Wooden. So who do you want at the bar with us?
In pairs?
Yes, sir.
I'll take Mark Twain and John Wooden.
I had a feeling that was going to be the case. I read up on you a little bit.
Yeah.
What is it that you love about Mark Twain, and especially with regard to what he teaches you about business?
Right. So again, if I was on the faculty of the business school, people always ask me, what should you read, what should you study, how do you learn to be an investor and whatnot? Well, there's a certain base level of technical stuff that you must understand. You got to get the debits and the credits right in Econ 101 and the 101, 102 level kind of stuff. But once you get past that, then the qualitative stuff starts to really resonate and matter more. So after you've really got your base level set, I think your study should be qualitative more than quantitative. And the thing I loved about Mark Twain, and the way that came to be is one time when my oldest was maybe 4 years old or so, we were going through the checkout at a supermarket, and they had one of those deals where for 39 cents when you bought some groceries, you could get these classic books. So I happened to be going through the grocery store checkout line with my daughter, and for 39 cents, I bought a Tom Sawyer book. And I had read it as a teenager, like we all did in class. And so for bedtime stories, I started reading my daughter Tom Sawyer as an adult. I said, wow, this is a very different book than what I thought I was reading when I was a kid. You see it through a different lens. And Mark Twain in particular, Mark Twain was both rich and broke, rich and broke, rich and broke many times in his life. And he was always chasing after money. Sometimes because he really wanted to have money, and he wasn't very good at managing it, so he always lost it when he did. So a subtext of a lot of Mark Twain's stuff is about money and finances and stewardship and all that kind of stuff. So if you really want to learn how to handle money, read Mark Twain and think about it through the lens of somebody who's been rich and broke and chasing after things and was on a treadmill his whole life. By the way, John D. Rockefeller sent a lieutenant to take care of him, which is how he's kind of got through things. But so that's what I like about Mark Twain.
And John Wooden?
And John Wooden, again, so as a kid growing up, we had a little basketball hoop out in the yard, and I used to shoot baskets all the time. And again, you're playing by yourself. You're not against competition. And I would always do the layups and whatnot, and I was right-handed, and my father said, do it from the left side, and I did not listen to my father, so my basketball career got cut short at 7th grade church league as a bench warmer. But so I was never going to chase a basketball dream. But as a kid, from kindergarten through 8th grade, I got Sports Illustrated, and I would save all the Sports Illustrated. Well, UCLA won the national championship every year of that particular slice of my mind. So in my mind, UCLA wins college basketball. That's how it is. So I became an admirer because kids like winners. So that's how I came to know of John Wooden from an early age.
Yeah.
Well, John Wooden retired after they won, I think 74, 75 was the last one. Mm-hmm. And he disappeared from view. And he was 64 years old at the time. He went out of public view for 12, 15 years. And then he started writing books. And his real background is as a teacher. And he was an English major in college. So as an adult, kind of like rediscovering Mark Twain, I rediscovered John Wooden through his books, through his writing, and his presence as a teacher, not so much a basketball guy. Yep. So here's a guy in his 70s and 80s just making his debut as an author, and every word just drips with common sense and resonates, and his teaching about life and how you treat other people is just, it's phenomenal, and it was always resonated, and it was backed up by his accomplishment. And the last thing about his consistency, so there was one HBO documentary about Wooden, and one of the filmmaking techniques that they use is, he had players from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the interviewer would ask a question, and a player from the 50s would start answering it, and they would cut sort of mid-sentence in the filming, and the 60s guy would pick it up, and the 70s guy would pick it up, and it would be the same sentence over 30 years, the consistency.
Yeah.
So what a marvelous human being.
I'm thinking every one of your words drips with common sense. I can't thank you enough for being here.
Thank
Before
you.
we wrap, let me just note that a few minutes ago, Tom said, if I were a faculty member in a business school, and our dean is here, and he could probably make that happen. So if you ever get tired of being co-CEO, we'd love to have you over here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tom, Richard, brilliant. You know, I can't get out of my head the imagery of you backing up a truck and getting Marriott stock into the back. I didn't know we were in for a comedy show this morning. Appreciate that very much. Yesterday we had Deloitte out in the hallway. They were recruiting our students. Next time I see them, I'm going to say, you know, you were in the Final Four. I hope you make it to the championship. That was another one that was really great. I also learned that it's going to take me about 30 years to figure out this job, and then I'll be all right. Thank you all very much for being here. We look forward to seeing you next time. Now join us outside for a quick reception. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tom.